Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Miller with TRECAtv. I'm a math instructional specialist, and joining us today is Dr. Kira Bailey from Ohio Wesleyan University.
Hi.
So, first off, what I want to do is I want to start by asking you a little bit about what your specialty is, what you teach, and then we'll kind of go into some other stuff.
Sure. So I am an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Ohio Wesleyan. So I teach a lot of different classes, including Introduction to Psychology and Introduction to Neuroscience. And I study brain activity and how video games actually can change your brain activity.
So, just as a little bit of clarification, when you say assistant professor, you don't mean that you assist a professor, right? Can you explain a little bit for our high school
Right.
students what that means?
Yes. Yeah. So when you start out as a professor, the lowest level of professor is an assistant professor. So that's like the first job you get when you're hired. And then you kind of go up from there. So after assistant professor, you become an associate professor. And then after that, you become a full professor. So it kind of has to do with how long you've been teaching.
Okay. And then adjunct is kind of a different thing.
Yes, an adjunct professor is someone who doesn't have a full-time job at that university, so they come in and teach a few classes, but they're not considered one of the full-time professors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, this is our first show. It's only fair to the viewers to let them know Kira's my wife. She's appearing from the other side of the house, and she's very sick. So, thank you for joining us. I know that you don't feel good right now, so I really do appreciate you showing up for me. So, I want to start. You had said that you work with video games. Can you tell us a little bit about what you study in relationship to video games? Because we have a lot of online students. A lot of those students love to play video games, and they may. I think the first thing their parents are going to say, "Oh, cool! Here's somebody who studies video games. They can tell me that video games are bad or video games are good, right?" So, can you tell me?
Yeah.
Can you say video games are good or bad?
No, I can't. What I can say is that what we know right now from the research is that at least the types of video games that we study the most have both good and bad effects. So the type of video game that has probably received the most attention from researchers are first-person shooter video games, so kind of your action, violent type of video game. And we know that there are some negative effects of those. So, for instance, playing violent video games can make you feel more aggressive. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll act out more aggressively, but you'll feel and think in more aggressive ways. And they also make it more difficult for you to control your own attention and to pay attention to things that are kind of boring in your environment. But there are also positive effects of playing first-person shooter video games, like improved hand-eye coordination, generally better visual and spatial skills, so like your navigation skills would be better. So from what we know right now, there are good and bad sides to playing video games. So when parents ask me for a recommendation, what I usually say is everything in moderation, which means it's okay to play a little bit of video games, but it should not be the only thing that you're doing.
And I want to go back and ask one more question, which was you had talked about aggression, and
Yes.
I do kind of I'd like to go a little bit more into that and talk about. I'd like for you to talk about is kind of the. Is it okay to call you an expert in this?
Sure.
At least compared to us, right?
Maybe not the biggest expert, but
Yeah. Well, compared to our knowledge, you're definitely an expert. So I would like to kind of understand the difference between aggression and violence, specifically in what they talk about within the studies, because we may use it differently as people who are not researchers, right? So what does it mean for a researcher to be aggressive?
right. So to be aggressive, so one way to think about it is that all violence is aggression, but not all aggression is violence. So there are different ways that you can be aggressive that may or may not mean that you behave violently. So we kind of think about it as the violence is like the outward behaviors, like if you punch or kick someone, that would be violence. Whereas aggression can be just that you kind of think more negatively about someone or a certain situation. It could be that you feel more hostile. So, you know how you feel when you get angry about something? That's aggression. So, feeling that kind of anger. And so, generally, when we're measuring these things in video game research, we're quite frequently measuring how people are thinking and feeling. So, are they thinking in more aggressive terms? Are they feeling more aggressive? There are some measures of actual aggressive behavior, but those, even in the laboratory, don't look like violence. So we wouldn't be, trying to see if people actually hit or kick someone. Instead, we might measure how likely they are to want to punish someone. So that's kind of getting at their intentions for violent behavior, but again, not really trying to look for violence. So we know that the video games increase aggression in all of these ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go out and hurt someone because they've.
Do all video games increase aggression? Or are we still specifically talking about first-person shooters? And for those who don't know, first-person shooters would include things like Counter-Strike. They would include things like the Halo series. Basically, when you're looking from the angle of your character and you are going around with a gun in your hand shooting things, right? So you're looking from the first-person's perspective shooting, first-person shooter.
Right. So those are maybe I guess I would say primary game that's been studied, although within the video game violence research, they've also looked at fighter style video games. So things like Mortal Kombat, for instance.
Street Fighter, those kinds.
Yeah, Street Fighter, right. Yeah, so those kinds of games have also been associated with increased aggression. And then there are at least a couple of studies that have also looked at violence in sports video games, so things like Madden. But in those games, sometimes you see increased aggression, sometimes you don't. So for the most part, when we talk about a violent video game, we're talking about either sort of a first-person shooter or a like Street Fighter style video game.
So a side-scrolling fighter, a 2D fighter.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, but as far as the reason why I initially mentioned first-person shooter video games is because those are the only ones that we know so far that have the positive benefit of improving your visual spatial skills.
Okay, and for and I'm going to stop you a couple of times, and I apologize because but where we have these conversations at home, these are not the kinds of conversations that many people have at their dinner table, right? Like we have a weird sort of dynamic. So when we talk about visual spatial, what we're talking about is your understanding of 3D space, right? And so for me, I want to talk about this being rooted in math because that's what I do. But maybe you can give kind of a more accurate explanation of what visual spatial skills are, or kind of a rundown.
Sure. So it means a couple of different things. One thing is navigation. So like being able to find your way around a map, which makes a lot of sense because that's what you're doing in a lot of these video games. So if you play a lot of those video games, you're a little bit better at that in real life. It also has to do with the amount of visual information in your environment that you can take in all at one time. So for instance, if you're looking at a picture in front of you, and you've been playing a lot of first-person shooter video games, you might likely take in more of that information in that picture faster than someone who doesn't spend a lot of time playing first-person shooter video games. And we call that in the scientific community, we would talk about that as being your visual working memory capacity. So it's just the number of things that you can kind of track with your eyes. So those are the kind of things that we're talking about.
Wonderful. So I just want to let our viewers know that if you have a question for Dr. Bailey, or if you have a math question for me that we want to go over on the board, you can tweet at TRECAtv, or you can email it to me if you are at TDA, and I'll get those and put them on. So maybe this is a good time. I did have a student submit a question for you, and this is from Jacob, and he has 2 questions. And I think his first question is there a definitive reason, and I think that's going to be a key word, and then maybe we'll do it without definitive, but is there a definitive neurological reason why some people are better able to understand mathematics than others? And he had asked about, he had talked in psychology about left brain versus right brain, but he had never talked about the hard science to support the theories.
Okay, so I'll talk about it a little more generally, and then maybe try to get specific. So the first thing is with the left brain, right brain distinction, it is true that the 2 hemispheres of your brain have slightly different specialties. So for instance, for the vast majority of people, not everybody, but for most people, your left hemisphere does most of your language process. So your ability to understand the words and the meaning of words that people are saying to you and produce the words that you want to say is a left hemisphere function, whereas your right hemisphere does have a role in language, but it is to kind of process things like sarcasm or humor. So there is a slight difference in how the 2 hemispheres process language. However, those differences are relatively minor, given that we all, for any sort of complex activity that you're going to do, are using both of our hemispheres to, both hemispheres are working together. So even though one hemisphere might have a slight specialty in one area over the other, the fact that you behave the way that you do, it has more to do with the way that they work together. If you were without either of the hemispheres, then your behavior would look very different.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
So, and I'm probably going to get some of this wrong because it's not my thing specifically, but so Dr. Ben Carson, who has run for president like a couple of times now, he was a neurosurgeon before that, and he didn't he start a procedure that was basically taking out half of your brain? How did that work?
Yeah, so it's called a hemispherectomy, which is just removing one hemisphere. And this actually is a great lead into the other thing that I was going to say generally about the brain, which is that your brain is very plastic. And I don't mean that it's like made of plastic. But what I mean by that is that it can change its structure and its function based on what you need it to do. So in the case of these kids, and they were all small children who had to undergo a hemispherectomy, usually because they were having seizures, they remove one half of the brain, and it's basically a complete hemisphere of the brain, and these kids recover, function fairly well. They do have some residual, so remaining motor difficulties on one side of their body, but for the most part they recover really well. And the reason for that is not because we don't need the other half of our brain, but because when you're that young, your brain is even more plastic than it is when you get older, and so their hemisphere that they have left is able to take over the functioning of the hemisphere that they had removed.
So basically, they're able to train the other parts because that's what they use them for.
Yes.
Maybe we can use that as a lead-in to talk about what video games can train your brain to do.
Right. So, so even though all of us, I mean, we can't, at this age have half of our brain removed and recover our functions because our brain doesn't remain that plastic. We all do maintain some brain plasticity through the rest of our life. And basically, plasticity is the reason you can learn anything. So, anytime that you learn a new skill, so like maybe you learn to play a new instrument, or you learn to play a new video game, so you start playing a new video game and you're not very good at it, but the more you play it, the better you get. Anytime that happens, that is because your brain can change as a function of what you are doing. And so, in terms of the research on video games, one of the things that I'm trying to understand is how the brain actually changes. So, how the plasticity of your brain changes to allow you to get things like better visual spatial skills, but maybe also some of the bad things like the decreases in attention. Because if we can understand that, then we might be able to build better video games that basically give you the good stuff of increasing your visual spatial attention, but without the bad stuff of decreasing your general attention.
So the second part of his, well, actually the first part of his question, because I kind of glossed over, was: is there a definitive reason why some people are better able to understand math?
So not that I am aware of, but I'll admit to not being as well read in the area of math learning. What I do know is that we all learn best the things that we practice the most. And so for a lot of people, when a particular topic is something that they really struggle in, they tend to put in less time and effort. I myself never felt like I was good at math. So when I was, in elementary and middle and even high school, I did not feel like math was my subject. And because it was hard for me, because I struggled at it, I didn't put a lot of time into it. And I think that that's fairly common, that we don't, if something's hard, we don't want to necessarily put in the effort. But what all of the research suggests is that your brain's going to get better at the things that you work at. And so the best way for any of us to get better at math or any subject is to actually put in the time and the practice so that our brain actually makes the changes that it needs in order for you to have those skills.
Looking back, do you feel like you were as bad at math as you thought you were?
Probably I wasn't. I was probably better at it than I thought that I was, but because it felt hard, it felt like it took more time than other subjects. I assumed that meant that I was bad at it.
Okay, fair enough. So he had another question, which was about the VARC models. So he said, I have read a lot about the VARC models, different learning styles, and I was curious as to what the best way someone who's more right-brained is to understand and do better in math.
So, learning styles come up a lot, and it turns out that as far as the research goes, there's actually no evidence to support that people learn better by teaching them in the manner that matches their learning style. So, for instance, if you took a learning style quiz and it said that you were a visual learner, you would not actually learn much better if I gave you more visual tasks than if I gave you more verbal tasks. And we think that the reason for that is that your brain actually learns best when you're outside of your comfort zone. So when you're learning in a way that is different from how you typically learn, that actually inspires more growth in your brain than doing the same things the same way you've always done. So if you want to get better at something, the main thing is that practice makes perfect. And also trying to test your brain, so make it do things outside of its comfort zone, is probably going to have a better effect than trying to match a specific learning style.
Thank you. So I did have a question from a 6th grader named Oscar, which is, what is the solution set for -2 greater than b divided by 3? I'm going to turn off the cams like they are now. I'm going to swap through. I'm going to leave your mic enabled, and we will still be able to see you, just as a warning. So if you're wanting to, like, if you need to go run for a minute or anything, let me know and I'll change it off. But okay, maybe. Oh, so I haven't done this one properly yet, so you won't be on camera. I'm sorry. Okay.
That's
So we had a student ask when he had the question, and I've got to change my pens around so this looks right. So 2 is greater than b divided by 3, right? And so let's actually paint this white so it's a little easier to see. 2 is greater than b divided by 3. Whoa. That's not helpful. Okay. So what that means is that whatever b divided by 3 is, we know that it is smaller than 2, right? So that's where we can start with our thinking. We know when we look at this, we say, okay, 2 is larger than b divided by 3. And that's the same thing as saying b divided by 3 is less than 2. And I might put it that way just because that's the way I like looking at it better. But it doesn't matter. It means the same thing. So what we know is, so if this is our number line, and let's start with red, and this is 2 right here. This means that b divided by 3, we don't know what it is, but we know that it's going to be in here. And any number that makes it in here is okay by us. Okay? So one thing we can think of is, we don't want to know what b divided by 3 is less than. We want to know what b is less than. Okay? So when we do this, we have this question, what is b divided by 3? That makes it less than 2. And we want just b. So we've got to break away this divided by 3. And so you can think of it in two ways. You can think of it as 1/3 b, or, which is the same thing as b divided by 3. It doesn't matter which way you think about it. The effect is the same. But what we want to do is we want to undo this division. And how do you undo dividing something? How do you undo splitting something into piles? And the answer is you push all the piles back together, right? Like if you split b into 3 separate piles, if you push all those 3 piles back together, you're going to have b again. So, since we divided all these piles by 3, we need to take 3 of the piles together to get b. Right? We separated b into 3 piles. Now we're going to multiply those 3 piles together, and we say if we had all 3 piles, that's the same thing as b. Well, we have one more hiccup, which is when we have these piles divided into when we have b divided into 3 piles, it's the same thing as 2. But when we have 3 separate piles, it's no longer going to be the same thing as 2 because we've changed what's on the left. And we can't change what's over on the left without changing what's on the right. So on the right, we're going to have to say, if this is the same as 1 pile, then this would be the same as 3 piles. And if you're in 6th grade, you may not know that the dot is the same thing as multiplication. So this would be 2 times 3. This would be 3 times b divided by 3. Well, so we have 3 times b divided by 3. Just right like this. And we have 2 times 3. Now the 2 times 3 is pretty easy. 2 times 3. You have either 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2. Doesn't matter. Ends up the same answer. 3, 6. But on the other side, we have 3b divided by 3. So if we have 3 b's, right, we have a b, and a b. We have 3 of those. We want to divide them into 3 groups. Then this is a group, this is a group, and this is a group. So each group is equal to b. So we end up with b is less than 6. So this red line right here represents b divided by 3. And it has to be less than 2. But for b itself, it's going to be 6. So b is less than 6. Now, as a caveat, this is actually, there's a very similar problem to this if you were working with negative numbers. And Oscar, I don't know if you're working with negative numbers in your class right now, so this may help you, this may not. But there is a slightly different question when you have b divided by negative 3. Okay? That's going to change the question very drastically. And if you have a chance to let me know if you're working with negative numbers right now, I will talk about that question. If you're not, I'm going to let that one go, and I'll get back to talking with Dr. Bailey. So thank you for submitting your question. And also I want to say thank you to, got to get back to my email. I want to say thank you to Jacob as well with his VARC models questions. Okay, we're back with Dr. Bailey. Thank you for being so patient.
No problem.
What game are you playing on your computer there?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm playing 2048.
So 2048 is, for my students who haven't played it, it's a little web game, and it works with the power of 2. So she's accidentally playing a math game for you.
Yeah, it's my favorite math game.
Fair enough. So we talked a little bit about your research. We talked a little bit about how your brain thinks about numbers and how you learn. I'd like to kind of step into and talk a little bit about how you use math in your... That was super loud, I apologize. So what I'd like to step into a little bit, I apologize. I got a message on the Facebook. I posted a link on Facebook and take questions as well. That was a super loud notification. I also want to talk a little bit about how you use math and what you do. And honestly, how you do what you do. Because we haven't talked about that. So you said you study the brain and you look at video games, but how do you do that? What do you use to study the brain? I mean, because you can't really cut people open and look at it. That seems like a pretty rough thing for a college student to do for a little extra credit. So
Yeah, it would be asking a lot of the students
mess up your hair
to donate their brains. No, so I have I do a technique that's called EEG, which is a short for a big long word, electroencephalography. So EEG, I basically put a cap on your head. The cap has a bunch of special sensors in it that can pick up activity from your brain usually while I'm getting this activity from your brain, you're doing some task on the computer. So I can see what your brain does while you're doing the task. And so what that gives me is kind of a bunch of squiggly lines, and I have to use math in order to interpret those squiggly lines. So I use math to average my data. So that means, like, if I have you doing a task on the computer, I have to compute the average of your brain activity every single time you see the same thing or do the same thing on the computer. So for example, like every time you make an error versus every time you get a response correct. I use math to graph the data so that I can look at what your brain activity looks like over time. And then I use statistics to help me figure out if what I'm seeing is a real difference in brain activity or if it's something that could have just happened by chance.
Fair enough. So when you talk about averaging brain data, so I guess there's an internet story that goes around, and it's been in a couple of talks and that sort of thing, even in conferences that I've gone to lately, by a Harvard professor, that, the myth of average, so to speak. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Maybe.
Okay, so I'll
It sounds
paraphrase.
familiar.
I'll paraphrase,
Okay.
and I apologize for putting you on the spot. And if you want to move on, you can just tell me. So basically, the idea was that the Air Force was designing cockpits for a very narrow group of people. You had to be within these dimensions. You had to be this tall between this and this. And when they went from planes and biplanes and propellers, prop planes, to jets, what they found is that their pilots were much less skillful. They were running into issues. They weren't able to command the space and those sorts of things. And after research, what they ended up finding is that it's not just height and weight. It is chest size, it is waist size, it is length of legs, it is length of arms. And the problem with it is that um, so you may look average when you put everything together, but really you have long legs, but you have a short torso, or you have a narrow waist, but you have a wide chest, or you have wide shoulders, and the problem with it is that you couldn't really design a cockpit for the average person because even when you looked at because people differ on so many different levels, so many different measures, so to speak, that the average wasn't a meaningful number. So now, so you do something a little different than that. You look at a single person, you said, and you were averaging their trials when they made a mistake.
Right.
So what are you trying to figure out about that person, and how is that different?
Okay, so I think that's a really great point, and I think that point speaks to kind of when we average across individuals. When I'm averaging within an individual, what I'm actually trying to do is reduce the amount of noise. So that I'm averaging out all of the random noise that happens on each trial, and I'm left with just the signal that is coming from the brain. And so, to explain a little bit more, because I'm recording the brain activity from your scalp, basically, so from the top of your head, that means that like your brain is underneath your scalp and your hair and your skull, and then it's also actually floating inside cerebrospinal fluid. And then you also have this protective casing around your brain called meninges. And so like before the signal even gets to the top of your head, it's already going through multiple layers of stuff. So it's a really weak signal. And then my electrodes that are on your scalp are pretty sensitive to be able to pick up that signal, but that also means that they're picking up any other electrical noise that's in the environment. So even other electrical noise from you. So things like your eye movements make electrical noise, your muscle movements, as well as electricity in the environment. So like if you've got a cell phone nearby, or a light on overhead. So the cap's picking up all of that. So every time you make an error or you make a correct response, there's the signal from your brain in there, but then there's also all of this other noise. And presumably the type of noise and the amount of noise that we're getting from each source for each trial is a little bit different and random. And so by averaging across all of those correct responses and incorrect responses, we can kind of cancel out all of the noise and just be left with the signal that comes from your brain.
Right. Fair enough. I've gotten a message back from the student who we talked to about the negative numbers. I'm going to swap back over and look at a math problem. And this is another problem that they've been facing, which was negative 11 divided by, or negative 11 is greater than s divided by negative 17. And I'm actually going to write that in white because, boy, is that hard to see in blue. So negative 11 is greater than s divided by negative 17. So I want to talk a little bit about dividing positive numbers and dividing negative numbers, because this is kind of a weird thing, right? When you say how many 5s are there in negative 15? Let's just take that as an example. And negative 15 is, that's not what I want. with that. So negative 15, no, I don't need that. Negative 5, negative 10, negative 15. So it's right here, right? And you say, how many intervals of 5 are there to get to negative 15? And what you'll see is you can never get there, right? You can never get there using 5s. So let's go ahead and make our 5s orange and say, okay. So we went 5, we went from here to here. Well, that's not going to get us there. What happens if we go 2 5s? We're here. That's not enough. Let's go 3 5s, okay? Doesn't matter how far we go, we're never going to get there going to the right. And every time you add another 5, that's what you're doing. You're going to the right. We don't want to do that. We want to go to the left. So when we have something like that, instead of going to 5, we're going to say, well, we want to go the opposite direction of 5. We want to go the opposite of 5. So let's do that we'll do that in purple, right? So this is 1 opposite of 5. This is 1 times negative 5. Takes us back to here. And then this is 2 negative 5s. And this is 3 negative 5s. So we realize we have 3 negative 5s to get to negative 15. So when we say what is 15 divided by 5, well, we can't find a positive number that does that, right? Now, sorry, that should be negative 15. Negative 15 divided by negative 5, we can do that really easily. That's 3, right? So what do we do about negative 15 divided by 5? And it turns out that there's a pretty easy way to look at it, which is, so we're going to say we did the opposite of 1. So this is negative. We did the opposite of dividing it once, the opposite of dividing it twice, and then the opposite of dividing it 3 times. So it equals the opposite of 3. 3 in the other direction, right? We can hear some tapping. Is that coming from your side?
Maybe.
Okay, cool. It stopped now. You're
Can you
good.
hear it now?
No, you're good. So when I wanted to use that as backstory before we get into this problem, which is that we want to get to negative 11. Negative 11, which is right here, is greater than s divided by negative 17. So we don't know what s divided by negative 17 is, but we know it's somewhere down in here. Okay? S divided by negative 17. So what's weird about this is, and I'm going to, once again, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to change that to be is less than negative 11, right? So here's negative 11. S divided by negative 17 is less than that. What's weird about this is I want to think about what would happen if we got rid of the negative sign, right? Because when we divide s by negative 17, that's different than dividing s by 17. We're saying divide s by 17 and then take the opposite of it, right? It means flip it over this middle line right here. Flip it over the line. So if we weren't dividing s by negative 17, if we were just dividing s by 17, it would be here, right? Because we would, not there. Help if I drew it in the right place. It would be here. If we were dividing s by positive 17, right? It would be here. Because we don't want the opposite of dividing it by this number. We want the same as. And so what you're seeing is that as we flip it over, when we don't do the opposite, we actually end up with this problem. So this is s divided by negative 17 on this side. And s divided by 17 is greater than 11. Okay? Because we're flipping it over, we're saying we don't want the opposite, we want just the regular. What would the regular answer be if we were dividing by 17? So we've got to do everything the opposite way. Okay? And so what you see is that when you eliminate a negative sign from an inequality, and For anyone who doesn't know, it's called an inequality because these aren't equal. They are unequal. This is greater than. So it's an inequality, not equal. When you are eliminating the negative sign from an inequality through multiplication or division, it's actually going to flip it the other way onto the other side. And part of that is it's actually going to flip the sign as well. So we had less than, and now we're going to have greater than. We could have had less than or equal to, then we'd have greater than equal to. If we had greater than, it'd be less than. You flip it the other way because you're taking it and you're shifting it to the other side, right? So this is our new problem right here. And then this becomes pretty easy. We solve that just like we solved the other one. So we had s divided by 17 is greater than 11. To get rid of that 17, if we had something and we broke it into 17 parts, and we put all 17 parts back together, then that would undo breaking it apart. But since we have two things that are linked together, we can't just do it to one side. That changes the value. So we've got to do it to both sides. So on the other side, we're going to have 11 times 17. And then this, when you put 17 groups together and then you take 17 groups, you break them into 17 groups, that cancels each other out. We end up with s is greater than 11 times 17. So we're going to change it to the parentheses here. So 1 times 17 is 17. 10 times 17 is 170. 187 when you add those together. And we end up with s is greater than 187. So thank you for sending in that question, guys. Okay. And that question's on a different layer. Okay. And we're back with Dr. Bailey. Hey.
Hey.
So we are getting a little short on time. We've been here for 45 minutes. So I want to say thank you to our friends who are still hanging in there with us. So we talked about learning styles. We talked about cutting out half your brain. We talked about a little bit about what you do and what it means to be an assistant professor. It does not mean that you get professor's coffee. Very different.
True.
Not that would be a bad gig. If you get people coffee, man, you do that. People need coffee.
Yeah, I'd love to have an assistant that got me coffee.
Yeah. So I'm in no way giving those people a hard time. What I do want to talk a little bit about is college and getting and that step into college. So my students are high schoolers for the most part. The people who are currently in my class, the people who are in my club, the video game club, Navigamers, could be as young as elementary all the way up to high school students. But there are definitely some of those students who are trying to kind of figure out what their next step in life is, right? And for some of those students, they may choose to go directly into a trade. They may choose to go into a business. They may decide to go into a profession that is, something like welding, something that's a trade that they're building skills. Others might choose to go to college. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about is that step for students. And for people who don't know, my wife and I, Dr. Bailey, we both grew up in West Virginia. And where we grew up amongst a lot of poverty. And so what that looked like is, it could look like anything from homelessness to friends living with other members of their family. Maybe they lived with an aunt and uncle because they were having trouble finding a place to live. Maybe that meant living in trailers. Maybe that meant moving around a lot. We lived in a place where people worked very, very hard to get by. Sometimes they couldn't find work. Sometimes parents couldn't keep work. Sometimes the work wasn't enough to take care of families. And there were just a lot of things that were going on. And I have no doubt that for some of our students maybe listening in right now on their TRECA computers or their TRECA phones, that's a similar situation, that they are working very hard, and even that hard work sometimes isn't getting them to where they feel comfortable and they can put away money to pay a lot of money for college, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about different ways that you can go to college, different ways that you can make that next step, um, and maybe who would be someone that they could go talk to when they need that help, right? Um,
Mhm.
for the record, at TDA, we have some lovely people who do work with transitions. Speak with your advisors or your counselors, and I'm sure they can put you into contact with our team that looks more towards, making sure that you get the degree, the high school degree that you're working for, looking at the next step in your life. But what are some things that you do maybe at OWU, Ohio Wesleyan, that you could tell us about?
Sure. So at Ohio Wesleyan, and I think this is probably true for most universities, we have a really wonderful admissions team who work very hard to make sure that students who apply to OWU are actually able to come here. And so a lot of that does come down, especially because Ohio Wesleyan's a private college, which means we're a little bit pricier than some of your public colleges. So for a lot of students, the kind of limiting factor is finances. And so one thing that our admissions and our financial aid offices do is they work very hard to help students make it a possibility, whether that is finding more grant money or finding ways, scholarships for like your academic performance in high school. So being part of the honors program here, finding work studies. So work study, you can come to OWU, and part of paying your way is that you spend a certain number of hours working in some office on campus. So you might get a job working for the admissions office, or you might get a job working in the psychology department. We often have a work study who doesn't get professors coffee, but does help us kind of organize things that are going on in the department. Sometimes helps us organize our research. So there are campus jobs like that that you can get. The other thing that's true for many of our students is they often don't come to OWU first. They actually transfer to OWU from community colleges. So community colleges are usually 2-year institutions that are a little bit cheaper, and you can usually find them a little bit closer to home. So if you're coming right out of high school and you're either not sure about the whole college thing yet, or you're struggling with money, a community college is a great way to kind of break in to that. And then OWU, as with many other colleges, will take the courses that you took at the community college and see where they fit with our courses. So usually it's not a wasted 2 years. It's the 2 years where you got to get some coursework done, but also got to maybe have a job while you were doing it, so that you could save some money to then go to a 4-year college.
And so,
so that's
I'm going to jump in.
yeah.
So I guess a couple of caveats. The first of which is I'm not trying to sell you OWU or any school, and I'm not even trying to sell you going to college. But I do, I did think it was important for our students to hear a little bit about some of the resources that are available to them. And so on top of TRECA, on top of talking to your counselors, to your advisors, talking to our team that help you transition into your future goals, there are other resources that exist to you. You had mentioned grants, finding grant money. Those are done at the federal and the state level. There are scholarships that are available at local events. There are scholarships that are available nationally. There are schools that will take a look at what you scored on the SAT or the PreSat or any of those sorts of things, and they reward tuition waivers based on that. I just, I think that if that's one of your goals, if that's what you want to do, if you see that as part of your future, that our students know that there are resources available to them, and that it is not their job as an 18-year-old who has never moved out of their house, who has never done any of those things, to be able to know how to get all that money for themselves, how to put themselves in a position where they can go, because it can be it can be tens of thousands of dollars a year when you think about tuition, when you think about housing, when you think about food, And that is a very, very big number for someone who's made $0 through high school, which is the case for many of our students. And some students have had jobs and some students have been working for a long time, but that's not the case for all of them. So I very much appreciate that. What is your job as a student is to look for the people who can help you, right? And so as Dr. Bailey's alluded to, the admissions department, wherever you decide to go, is going to be a good resource for you. Do you do a lot with former graduates of your institution? Do you have an alumni association or someone who keeps in contact there?
Yeah, we do have an alumni association. So there's a campus office that specifically works with alumni. We actually have, I just found this out recently, that we have something called externships, which our current students actually go work with our alumni. So it gives them some real world experience while they're in college, which I think is kind of cool. But also we have, so OWU has a Facebook page. And so does the psychology department. So if you're, again, not to peddle OWU too much, but if you are interested, you can look us up on Facebook. And I would reiterate what Mr. Miller was saying previously. If you want to go to college, but you're worried about finances, don't let that stop you. Contact the campuses that you're wanting to potentially go to, and you will find people who will be happy to help you figure it out. We want everybody to go if that's what they want to do. And so we'll, find a way.
So, and for my students, this is very important. There's a huge difference between a grant and a loan. And if you go through and you are taking the exponential growth lessons, you are going to notice there's a huge difference between a grant and a loan. A grant is a gift. As long as you continue to meet all of the requirements, grants are money that you do not have to pay back. There are some loans that have loan forgiveness, where if you follow certain rules, then you don't have to pay all of them back. But most loans, what they say is, you are going to pay us back this money with interest, right? So if you decide that you want to go to a college that's $75,000 a year, that's what you need to go. And there are colleges that cost that much, which is, quite a chunk of money. Then what that means is that at the end of 4 years, you will owe them 75 times 4. So 75, 150, $300,000. And then depending on the type of loan, it could either start accumulating interest after you graduate, or it could start accumulating interest the first time you take a check. So that is not to scare you away from taking loans. I took loans, some loans. I know most people took some loans going through. I don't believe you did you, Dr. Vale?
No, I didn't.
No.
But I was lucky. And I would say I was lucky because I started, like, my junior year of high school, I started thinking about the fact that I was one of those kids that finances was going to be an issue. And so I worked really hard to find all of the grants that I could and all of the, local scholarships. Mm-hmm. So that's how I got around taking. And I went to an in-state school. So maybe that's another thing. I don't know if your students know that generally you get a break if you go to a college that's in your home state versus going to a college that's out of state. Right.
And there are some wonderful schools here in state, and that may be what you want to do, that may be not what you want to do. But I just, while we had someone here that could talk to us a little bit from the college side of things, I wanted to talk about those things. So it is a little after 8, and we could swing into some gameplay. I don't know who's sticking around. But, I really appreciate you coming out to talk with us. And I know that you've been feeling sick, so thank you so much for doing it anyway. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap here. And then I'll actually, maybe I'll do some gameplay another night, everybody, if you're still interested. But thank you very much, Dr. Bailey, and thank you for those people who have submitted questions and have questions. If you have questions for us, I'm going to check Twitter one more time to make sure I don't have anything that I missed, because that would make me really sad to have missed a... But I think we're good. Okay, so we've gotten all the questions that have been submitted done. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and to all the students, if you ever have questions for me, go to olu.edu and look me up.
Yes. And so what you're saying is students can email you directly. They don't have to.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So there you
You're
go.
welcome.
You can bother a professor directly. And if you have other questions, I do know where she lives because it's here. So if you have questions that you want to know about college, or if you have these questions and you didn't realize you could ask them this week, go ahead and ask us anyway. And I can always either bring her back or have her give me the answer so I can tell you about it. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for being here. And everyone, you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care.